Hi, folks. As always, I need to adjust my, okay. Hi, folks. So as I mentioned last week, I cannot be there Friday, but I will be there in spirit and on whatever you want to call this. It's not film. But I will be there speaking to you. And in particular, this week, logically enough, I'm going to be talking about hearings, the importance of hearings, congressional hearings. Now, as ever, I had to look and see if I had discussed this before, which I have, I think about 2 years ago, but in a different way with a different approach. So I'm not repeating myself. I think there's probably like one idea that I'm repeating, but I'm not going to be repeating what I said before. Rather, this time, I'm going to be talking about why it's important, these kinds of hearings, why they're important regardless of what happens after them. And what's interesting, and one of the reasons, I mean, there's an obvious reason why I chose to talk about this, because Thursday night, so just the night before you'll be watching this, is the first hearing on the January 6th attack. And as I'm looking around and I'm seeing coverage of it in the press, what I'm not seeing at all is a real discussion of why it's important. I see people on the right condemning it as theater, and people on, I suppose, also on the right condemning it as a partisan display. I've seen a lot of coverage of the fact that Fox is not going to be covering the hearing in full. That's gotten more coverage than the fact that the hearings are actually happening, which is striking, and to me, a really serious lapse. And that's what I want to talk about today. And I'm really sorry I won't be there to answer questions, because there are many topics over, I think I don't have Carolee here. I think this is the 114th straight episode. In all of that time, there have been any number of topics which I have felt were important. This is one that I think is particularly important, and I think in relation to what I just said, because the significance of this is getting like no press coverage at all. And I will probably retweet an op-ed that I wrote about this a little while back, maybe a year ago, about why hearings are important. And some of what I'm talking about today, you'll see if you go look that up, I discussed in that as well. And I was asked explicitly to discuss that because then as now, I was talking about how important these hearings were and would be, and how people were dismissing them as unimportant. So let's look a little bit at a few hearings in the past, look at what happened, look at the response or what people said about them or why they thought they were important. And then as ever, we will circle back and talk a little bit about what that can help us with in looking at what's happening today. Now, the first, I can hear Newbie's peeping away there, so I don't know if you can hear him, but he's in the mix. The first episode I want to mention took place in April of 1850. And obviously, as with this particular hearing, the ones I'm going to be talking about today happen when something goes awry in Congress. And there needs to be an investigation and then a hearing. So in this case, April of 1850, the Senate is discussing the Compromise of 1850, which has to do with the admission of slave states and free states into the Union. And it was a tense debate. And on this particular day in April of 1850, Thomas Hart Benton, Senators Thomas Hart Benton and Henry Foote, essentially engaged in a rumble. Foote had been insulting Benton. Foote was sort of diehard defender of slavery. Benton was more willing to at least discuss what was going on. So Foote threatened and insulted Benton. And after a long time of doing this, Benton lost his temper and apparently knocked his desk. The glass of water on his desk went flying, jumped to his feet, and Foote had brought a gun with him to the Senate that day and had talked to friends about how if Benton came after him for what he was going to say. He talked about what direction he would run so that he would not hurt bystanders if he had to shoot his gun. This is the Congress I write about. So this happens, right? Benton like jumps out of his seat and rushes towards Foote. Foote jumps to his feet and pulls a pistol out and aims it at Benton. Benton dramatically opens his frock coat and says, "Let the assassin fire." And there's no firing, and people grab Foote and they take the gun away from him, and the matter ends. And actually, as happens often with these incidents, Congress is about to settle down and just go back to business. And yes, it's an ugly pistol episode, but they're just going to go back to work. And John Parker Hale from New Hampshire, Senator John Parker Hale of New Hampshire, stands up and says a couple of things that are really interesting. First, and this is in line with something I've talked about a number of times before, about how social media has changed the way what's happening at Washington plays, and how briefly it can be a second when something expands and spins out of control. And the Telegraph was doing that in this time period. And it's only the late 1840s that it's beginning to be used. So 1850, it's still relatively new. And so Hale, after this episode, when everyone goes back to work, he's like, "Oh, no. So let's wait a moment here. First off," he says, you all realize here, right, that in like 45 minutes, the nation is going to be reading that we're slaughtering each other here in the Senate. Right? We don't have control of that at all. So number one, that's a big problem. Number two, he says, it's important to do something that will show the American public that we've taken this in hand, as well as informing them about what really happened, vindicating the character of the Senate. And I'm going to use his line here, what he said. He said that there must be a formal investigation, not only, quote, "for vindicating the character of the Senate, but to set history right and inform the public as to what did take place." So the importance here is people need to know what actually took place. There has to be some sign that Congress had taken this in hand and responded to it, so that in essence, Congress was a functioning institution protecting itself and the government. And that is indeed what happens, is that there's an investigation. Again, is there a dramatic outcome with the investigation? No. But part of what I'm going to be arguing today is a dramatic outcome. I mean, an actual investigation and a hearing and then an outcome is great. But even without a desired outcome, as Hale says here before they set up an investigation, even without any kind of an outcome, the actual hearing is important. Or an investigation is important, right? It's important to show Congress functioning. It's important for, in essence, a line to be drawn in the sand. It's important for the public to actually know what's going on in its representative body and what the public's representatives are doing. And it's important for people to basically understand and either have a sense of vindication for the government, or more likely, at least understand, given that it's misfunctioning, how it's misfunctioning, and the fact that there are some in the government who are willing to say, yes, we recognize this was wrong, and we're going to draw a line. So that's one moment where there was this moment of mayhem, and then basically they decide, we better do something here to show that Congress took it in hand, that things are under control, and that the public needs to know what actually took place. So now beam way ahead in time. That's 1850. Go almost a century, a little over a century later. Let's go to the McCarthy hearings in 1954, which is another case in which there's a line drawn about something that is seen as beyond the pall. And in this case, it's the public that helps with this. And many of you, I'm sure, already are thinking about the famous line that Joseph Welch, who's the chief counsel for the Army in this hearing, McCarthy attacks during the hearing a young colleague of Joseph Welch's, the chief counsel, and Welch, in response, says, among other things, turns to McCarthy and says, "Have you no sense of decency, sir? You know, you've attacked any number of other things, and now you're attacking this young man in front of the nation. Have you no sense of decency, sir?" And the audience ultimately applauded that line. And in essence, that was a way of showing that a line had been crossed. Now, it's important to note, it wasn't as though the audience applauded and yay, everything's set back to right. It's all good, right? Everyone said, life is good. Nor did that end McCarthy's power, but it dented it significantly. It enabled and encouraged some people to back away from him. So it didn't end his influence, but it certainly did a lot of damage. And again, that moment of applause was a dramatic way of an audience saying, you've gone too far. We don't like what you're doing. It's not proper. And you may be claiming that what you're doing is for the public good, but we're actually not going to go with you down that road. That was a line drawing moment. I think that, in the last few days when I've been talking with many other people about what's going to happen on Thursday, the opening hearing, and they've all referred back to Watergate, the 1973 hearings, which were broadcast live for 2 weeks. And the hearings reached millions of American homes daily. And at that point, and I am eager to see what happens, but I'm kind of not expecting the same. At that point, people everywhere were watching, right? I have a vague memory of that. I was, like 10 or 11, something like that. I remember that it was everywhere, that everyone was watching it. And it was just everywhere, right? That you knew it was important, even as a kid. I didn't fully understand what was going on, but I knew it was important. Apparently, the live broadcasting of the hearing combined with really aggressive newspaper coverage had an impact. So before the hearings, polling showed that 31% of Americans considered the Watergate break-in a serious matter. So that 31%. After the hearings, 53% considered it a serious matter. So if nothing else, watching the hearing, seeing what was going on, seeing that it was being taken seriously, seeing that it was being shown to the nation, seeing evidence and testimony had an impact. Now, again, can I say, and because of that, blah, blah, blah. No, I can't. But what I can say, Americans understood that something significant had happened, and they were watching a line in the sand get drawn by looking at those hearings and witnessing what people were saying and judging for themselves what was being said and the implications of it. Now, one last example I want to mention before I segue back to the broader idea. It's a less commonly known one, but this one's particularly interesting because of the reason why ultimately it's kind of tabled and pushed out of the way. And this has to do with the burning of Washington in 1814 during the War of 1812. So after everything is over, there are a lot of questions about who was dealing with security? Where was the security for Washington, D.C. at that moment in time? Who was supposed to be doing something, right? The British just sort of marched in and they burned things and ravaged things. They set the Capitol building on fire. Strikingly, there is mention of a soldier standing on the speaker's chair while fire, sort of around him in the House chamber. We saw other images of people standing on the speaker's chair so recently during the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. So it's serious, right? And Congress basically says, okay, that was serious, right? The Capitol burned. Who was supposed to be doing something? Where was the security? Where was the protection? How did this happen? That it just people walked in and did what they did. So Congress understood that this was important. They all stood up and pontificated about how it was important to figure out who was to blame. Right? What happened here? They create an investigatory committee. The committee creates an enormous report of several hundred pages, all kinds of testimony and everything else. And in the end, the report blames nobody. It just doesn't explain it. It just, as I think it's Daniel Webster says, this is a chronicle. It's not an investigation. It just describes what happens, but it doesn't answer any questions. I think I don't think I quoted him explicitly, but that's what he basically says is the committee did nothing that we asked them to do. They have now issued a report on what happened and not explained any of it. And ultimately, the report is tabled and pretty much forgotten. And the reason why it's ignored and tabled and forgotten was noted by someone at the time who said, well, the House could no more discuss than the committee pronounce upon transactions implicating so many marked personages. And to restate that in blunter language, well, I mean, neither Congress or the committee could hold forth and condemn all of these important people. They would have to condemn to actually blame someone for what happened. So we won't blame anybody. We'll just do the minimum that we can do. And hey, we had an investigation. And gee, isn't it unfortunate that that happened? That's a great example of, I think, some of what we're wrestling with now, which is, you know, do we call people in to testify? Are they going to be willing to testify? Does it matter if you ignore a congressional subpoena? There are so many questions here, but you certainly get the sense that some of what Congress is wrestling with and has been for some time is, what do you do when people in the highest ranks of the national government are potentially involved in something serious like an attack on the government, an attack on Congress, an attack on the Capitol? And some people seemingly are responding by saying, oh, no, you certainly don't interrogate them. That's bad. You know, all of this talk about it's being divisive. We should not do that. What do you get from that? And then you get back to talk about it being a partisan display. You know, I don't know what all the things I saw online today. You know, a show. It's theater. It's a democratic, you know, one-act play or whatever it is. People are of all kinds on the right are doing any number of things to say there's no meaning here. It's meaningless, and it's even worse than that. It's meaningless and divisive and partisan. And why is it happening? Which is why I'm here talking about this today, because obviously, based on what I've just discussed, is there theater involved with a hearing like this? Yes, right? I mean, by definition, a hearing like this is a performance. It's the purpose of it. If you're having a public hearing, you are performing the process and outcome of an investigation before the American public, most of the time. And we're talking about modern day and technology, but still, the hearing that we're going to be seeing is being shown to the American public as something that is significant. Is there theater involved in that? Yes. Have the Democrats consulted TV executives and a variety of other people to get guidance to how they might present this in the most effective way? Sure. So I'm not going to deny that there's a theatrical component to a public hearing with ideally an audience of millions. That said, it's really important theater. It's not empty performance. It's basically the theater of democracy in action. You can see the American public essentially being addressed and informed about an important event that happened. You can see Congress itself in action, confronting a direct attack on the US government, on the political process, any number of ways in which there was a direct frontal attack of a really shocking nature. With a hearing, you can see Congress addressing it. So in essence, you could see an institution functioning, which is important, and you can see basically a line being drawn that this is unacceptable. In a hearing, but no matter what happens, even if it happens, it passes, and no one decides anything, the fact that it's happening, the fact that people are organizing this and they will come forward and they will say explicitly, here are the many ways in which this is unacceptable, undemocratic, un-American. And yes, people can dismiss all of that and say, oh, it's just partisanship. None of that is true. But the fact of the matter is, it has to be done. It has to be said, because think about it. If that didn't happen, if there was no hearing, if there was some kind of investigation and no one, we really didn't hear what happened. If what happened on January 6th happened, and there was essentially no direct public response stating bluntly, this crossed a line. This is not how our government works. without that kind of statement, you're essentially saying, well, that was fine. The lack of a hearing normalizes what happened. It says basically it's not important enough to do anything about. So although it's kind of a quirky conclusion for me to make, I am indeed saying that regardless of the outcome of the hearings, the fact that they are happening is vitally important. Important for the historical record, important because we, the American public, deserve to know what happened, and important because we can see Congress basically defending itself and acting as a functioning institution that is defending the government and having a hearing, right? So we're seeing Congress actually in action, doing what it's supposed to be doing in a case in which certainly something needs to be done. And we're seeing that there is a line being drawn, that there are people standing up and saying, this shouldn't have happened. Here are all the ways in which this was improper. Here's all the evidence we have that shows people were actually, whatever it's going to show. I won't even go down that road. But anyway, the evidence and the testimony and whatever else we see in these hearings, in one way or another, will be saying, here, all of this, in one way or another, it should not have happened. And here are all the ways in which it's improper. And lines were crossed, important lines were crossed. And we are saying that here and now before the American public on the record for history, for the historical record. For all of those reasons, it's so important that this happen and that people watch it and understand it's not just a show. It's not just a little partisan show, right? Which some people are acting as though that's all it is. Even, with our press, which consistently, what about everything? They're like, well, it's a Democrat partisan thing and the Republicans will do some other partisan thing. And it's just, they're all doing the same thing. No, no, right? It isn't just another political thing that the Democrats are doing. It's bigger than that. And regardless of the fact that you can say, well, it's organized by Democrats and the Democrats want it to happen and an outcome to be a certain outcome, and it will help them if that outcome happens, and all of the ways in which what's happening can be described as partisan and favoring the Democrats, the important part of it is that it happens, that it's recognized as being significant, that the public can see and hear and understand that there are lines that can't be crossed, that there are ways in which an institution, the American government, can function and defend itself, and that it isn't, we don't live in a free-for-all where people can do anything and everyone's afraid to act. So I think personally, these hearings are vitally important for all of those reasons. I'm a little bit stunned and somewhat disheartened at the fact that that message appears to be nowhere, right? I'm just not hearing the hearings discussed in that way at all, right? People are talking about popcorn parties. I think I read today that the Republicans are going to have a sort of press meeting talking about, actually before the hearings happen, talking about whatever the heck it is they're going to talk about, and they're blocking some of the liberal press from going to their press meeting, which, if part of what's going on here is that an investigation is being held before the entire American public so that the American public can see and think and witness and, conclude what they want. Eliminating a block of the press that you're afraid of because they disagree with you, that would be not opening an investigation to the American public so that they can draw their own conclusions. That begins to move into the realm of blocking certain facts, spinning as you want to spin it, silencing the opposition, and that begins to move in the direction of propaganda. So what's important is the publicity of this, the broadness of people who can see it and conclude what they want, the ability to say, yeah, it's going to be the Democrats, there are Republicans involved in it. It's not only Democrats, but that yes, there's going to be a partisan component to it because it serves the Democrats and hurts the Republicans, depending on how people respond to this. But regardless of the partisan impact, the actual hearing is vital. That's the message that people need to understand. People need to see that January 6th described, acted on, and ruled as unacceptable, not how we work, a clear attack on our government, a clear crime against democracy. They may or may not believe it. They may dismiss everything that happens in these hearings as a bunch of democratic hoo-ha. Fine. Not everyone's going to do that. And if these people don't have a hearing, as I said before, if this were not going to happen, just roll that around in your mind a little bit and think back to this attack on the Capitol. Imagine if there's absolutely no formal public response. What does that tell you? Think about the power of that silence. It tells you that it wasn't a big deal. It tells you that on a certain level, it's kind of normalized. It invites more of the same. Will having a hearing prevent it from happening again? Not necessarily. But again, it's a subtle message, but I think a crucial one, which is it has to happen, because if it doesn't happen, the implications of that are vital and obvious and dire. So for all of these reasons, I hope all of you, the community, the History Matters community, will do your best to circulate among you and yours some aspect of what I just said, which is this is an important public airing above and beyond all of the theater and partisanship. It's important that it happens. It's important that we watch. It's important that we think about it and draw conclusions. It's important that we see the government in action, drawing a line in the sand, and that you will encourage people around you to watch it and think of it that way, to watch it and not think like, hey, what are the Democrats going to do now? But rather, in what way is this actually drawing a line in the sand? Because that's the important part of what's going to be taking place in this hearing. And we can't say that enough, because as far as I can tell, it's not being said right now at all, or certainly I haven't seen it. So at any rate, I think that's mostly what I have to say about the hearing. Obviously, I'm getting myself all worked up about this because I feel this very strongly. I have from the very beginning. I've been talking about accountability for as long, even before January 6th, but I've been talking about the fact all over the place on Twitter that we're in something of a crisis of accountability right now, where no one feels that they should be accountable for anything. And that this falls into that category too. You can do what happened, and particularly if you're in the government and facilitated it, and you assume you shouldn't be held accountable for that, think about that, right? Democracy is grounded on public servants who are accountable to the public. They're servants, right? They're like servants. Accountability is how a democracy, a democratic government works. It's the public giving power to people in one way or another, and the people who have that power being accountable for their use of it to the people. That's it. So if you have people in office who feel unaccountable, who feel that they can do whatever they want and it doesn't matter because who the heck cares what the public wants, and we'll just lie to them a little bit and then they'll shut up and we can do what we want, that's not a functioning democratic government. So for all of these reasons, for the sake of a little bit of bolstering for a functioning democratic government, you should spread the word about how significant what we're going to see is, for the reasons that I said, above and beyond all of the ways in which people will try to dismiss it. The fact that it's happening is crucial because it spreads an important message, and without it, it communicates an even stronger one. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I see I'm at a half hour. I don't have my air conditioning on, so I'm sweaty. However, this time, unlike other times when I pre-recorded an episode, I remembered the mug. I'm so proud of myself. Maybe he's been very quiet back there. I don't know, maybe he's like a little intimidated by the topic. At any rate, this mug makes perfect sense. It probably doesn't surprise some of you. However, it is my US Capitol mug, right? How could any other mug be more appropriate? I bought it in the Capitol after I interviewed a member of Congress, right? So it's right from the heart of the thing. And it shows you, that building, the Capitol building, which is the center of our representative government and is symbolic in its meaning and power in all kinds of ways. So the mug itself is also a reminder of all of the ways in which whatever is going to happen at these hearings is important. Okay, I do feel like I got myself all worked up. I feel very strongly about this, and hopefully you will spread this message and encourage people to watch and encourage people to think about it that way. I am sorry I cannot be there with you folks, particularly given that it's going to be the day after the first hearing, and I'm sure you're all going to have lots of questions. So keep them in mind. It's not the last hearing, it's just the first one. And we can discuss and have questions and do that as a group when I'm back in the saddle, so to speak, and joining this community to have a discussion about it. So anyway, watch it, see what you think. And as ever, you know, just as Coming Together here, we engage in democracy by engaging in these conversations. By watching that hearing, you are engaging in democracy as well. So do it, think about it, and we will find a way to talk about it as a group. And I am going to sign off. I think that's it. I'm going to sign off. I can't say poof. However, I think there will be an after party, so I'll say poof for no reason at all. This is my loyalty to you guys. Poof, we're going to have the after party. At any rate, have a wonderful week, and I will see you next Friday. Bye, folks.